Good day. The most interesting news from the battlefronts today has actually come from Britain, where the British Ministry of Defence appears to be preparing the British public for the imminent fall of Bakhmut in Donbass. The Ministry of Defence regularly publishes updates, bulletins, call them what you will. But as I've discussed on many occasions, these do not actually provide any real intelligence, any real information about what's actually going on the battlefields. Rather, they appear to be principally intended as steers to the media, the British media, giving an insight as to what the British authorities want the British media to say about any particular development. And we read, for example, from this latest statement from the British Ministry of Defence, that Russia has prioritised as its main offensive effort since early August 2022 the capture of Bakhmut. The capture of the town would have limited operational value, although it would potentially allow Russia to threaten the larger urban areas of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Now, that last sentence, I have to say, takes my breath away, because we're told that the capture of Bakhmut would have limited operational value, but at the same time, it would allow Russia to threaten the larger urban areas of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Well, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, after Bakhmut's fall, would be the last remaining holdouts of Ukrainian control in Donbass. If Bakhmut falls, if the position of Ukrainian forces in Donetsk city crumbles, and that's looking increasingly likely as well, by the way, then all that is left of any real significance for Ukraine to hold on to in Donbass would be Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. These are the two, far and away, the two biggest places that the Ukrainians would still control in Donbass. And I've often heard reports that Kramatorsk is in fact the area, the place which would be most threatened by Russian forces if Bakhmut were to fall. And of course, and Kramatorsk is also apparently the place where the high command, the headquarters of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass is located. So the British Ministry of Defence is telling the British media, in effect, that the fall of Bakhmut would be of little operational value to the Russians. In fact, they go on to say there is a realistic possibility that Bakhmut's capture has become primarily a symbolic political objective for Russia. That's what they say on the one hand, but on the other hand, they admit that the fall of Bakhmut would create threats to Ukrainian positions in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. In other words, to the entire Ukrainian defense effort in Donbass. So you see, on the one hand, how the British Ministry of Defence appears to be trying to steer the British media. It's telling them that you mustn't emphasize the military importance of Bakhmut. This is only a symbolic victory for the Russians if it is achieved, whilst simultaneously conceding that in fact the fall of Bakhmut would be of very great operational significance indeed. But is Bakhmut really about to fall? I've been giving a whole series of string of videos over the last couple of days which rather suggest that. And a official of, I think, the Donetsk People's Republic has indeed predicted that Bakhmut is likely to fall at some point this month. And there are reasons to think that that is the case. First of all, we have had a rather strange disclosure about the actual conditions of the fighting in and around Bakhmut from, of all places, the Daily Express. This is a tabloid British newspaper, which, like all tabloid British newspapers, takes an absolutely militantly pro-Ukrainian line. It doesn't really ever admit to the fact that Ukraine is suffering from any problems, any military problems at all. But then we read this, or rather the readers in the Daily Express would have read this. Inside Bakhmut front line, littered with corpses and colossal losses. That's from the Daily Telegraph. And then we go on to read that the Ukrainian commander of the Svoboda Battalion, by the way, is one of the more ideological right-wing units of the Ukrainian military. Petro Kuzik, whose unit is one of those holding Bakhmut, said his soldiers are staying in trenches full of corpses, fighting in extremely cold conditions and in knee-deep water against Russian attacks. I apologize for speaking slowly now because I'm very cold. It's making me dizzy. I've now left the first line since I was called. I'm warming up in the car. I'm almost falling asleep because I haven't slept all this time. They charged yesterday quite seriously. They presumably are the Russians. They felt a weakness in our defense because, I will not name the numbers of the units so as not to spoil their honor, there are units that are less motivated than ours. And yesterday they weakened our defense a little in the area just around Bakhmut. Some units could not withstand this artillery onslaught and retreated. I'm going to come back to the question of artillery in a moment, by the way. This is our principle. We, the Svoboda Battalion, do not retreat, and because of that, we found ourselves in a semi-surrounded situation, and we had a lot of work to do. He doesn't explain what that work is, whether they retreated as well. He says that they don't retreat. He doesn't explain how they dealt with this predicament. But then he goes on to say this. In addition, it is a swamp full of mud. It is very difficult to evacuate the wounded or to deliver the ammunition. The trenches are constantly deteriorating, and in this swamp they must be constantly rebuilt. He added, today is the first day without rain, but then and yesterday when it fell, all the water flowed into the trenches, and the shelling was such that it was impossible to get out of the trench, so the guys were constantly wet for a day or two. Plus, the temperature is like this. Many are confused, many with pneumonia, but we hold our ground and we defend. I see young guys standing with their teeth clenched. I would really like someone to write about their achievements because few people in the country know about it. So we see that the situation is actually very grim. And by the way, he goes on to say, Mr. Kuzik goes on to say that the area is littered with corpses, that Ukraine is suffering colossal losses, those are his words, that the Ukrainians have given up trying to collect the bodies of the dead. And one worries too about whether some of these people really were dead, whether they might have been injured, whether they might have been rescued, but it seems quite possible that that might not have been the case. So that suggests, and it's a Ukrainian take on things, that the situation in Donbass is extremely bad, that the situation in and around Bakhmut is extremely bad. And there's been another report. Now, this is from the other side. It actually seems to come from a Greek source. I say that it's published originally in a Greek magazine. But I've been provided with an English translation. Obviously, I can speak Greek myself, but this is an English translation provided by someone who sends me this information privately. Now, I should explain there are a lot of Greeks living in Ukraine, especially in eastern Ukraine. Mariupol was a center of the Greek community in Ukraine, as it happens. The Greek population of Ukraine was in general opposed to the Maidan events in Ukraine in February 2014. They were critical. Some of them, most of them, were, in my experience, actively hostile to the new Ukrainian government that was established in 2014. And there are quite a few of them involved in the Donbass conflict. And I suspect that they're pretty well informed about what's actually going on. And of course, they're passing on information to people in Greece, and that's how this information gets published there. Anyway, I'm going to read now from the an extract from this piece translated for me by someone else. I mean, my translations are not always to be relied upon, but this is what this person says, that the Russians have entered Vodyane. This is I gather, another town. This is in the Donetsk area. It's an important town for capturing Avdiivka, the main base of Ukrainian forces shelling Donetsk city. Anyway, the Russians have entered Vodyane and are clearing Nevelskoye. Now, Nevelskoye is a small village between Svatovo and Kupiansk. I discussed a short time ago how the Russians appear to have captured it, and that this is bringing them closer to Kupiansk, one of the towns in Kharkiv region that Ukraine captured over the course of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv region back in September, that the Russians appear to have captured Nevelskoye. We then got reports a few days ago that the Ukrainians had launched a counterattack trying to recapture Nevelskoye. I read that that counterattack had been repulsed, and it seems that the Russians are now consolidating their control of Nevelskoye. So this report talks about Russian advances in two completely different places. Vodyane in Donetsk region, near Donetsk city, close to Avdiivka, the main fortified position of the Ukrainians near Donetsk city, and Nevelskoye further north in Donetsk region, north of Bakhmut, between Svatovo and Kupiansk, threatening Ukrainian positions in Kupiansk. And the article goes on to say Kiev will have to decide very soon which areas it will surrender and which areas it will defend. The Ukrainian army has entered a state of emergency in the Donbass as Russian forces advance on several fronts. The Russians have entered Vodyane and are very close to clearing Nevelskoye as well, shielding the Donetsk perimeter. Under the brunt of the Russian advance, the Ukrainian military command is moving the 80th Brigade, the 81st Airborne Brigade, and the 95th Separate Airborne Brigade to Donbass. At the same time, the 65th Brigade and the 16th Battalion of the 58th Independent Motorized Brigade have left Zaporozhye and are being rushed to Bakhmut. All the indications are that the Ukrainian offensive towards Melitopol from Zaporozhye has been called off. Their primary purpose now is to strengthen the defense of Bakhmut, but to what end and at what cost? Well, I can't answer those latter questions, but that's this report from this Greek source, and I suspect, for what it's worth, it's a fairly accurate summation of the situation. And as I repeat from that other program I did a short time ago, it seems that there are something like 30,000 Ukrainian troops in and around Bakhmut who are now at very, very serious risk of encirclement. And on Wednesday, by the way, another Russian official reiterated that all the roads leading into Bakhmut are now well within range of Russian short-range artillery, the railways as well, and that in order to try to access Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces have to move across fields in places, all of this in swampy ground, the kind of swampy ground that Mr. Kuzik was reporting to us from the commander of the Svoboda battalion, which is fighting in Bakhmut. And this is obviously making Ukrainian communications ever more difficult. So you're looking at a definitely deteriorating situation in Bakhmut. And as I said, the British Ministry of Defence has in effect confirmed Ukraine's crisis in Bakhmut and seems to be preparing everyone in Britain, providing steers to the British media how they are to cover this story when Bakhmut does indeed fall, which the Russians seem to think will happen at some point this month. Now, let me repeat again, the fall of Bakhmut will mean the end of what is being gradually acknowledged even by parts of the Western media. I saw an article to that effect in Newsweek, for example. It will mean the final end of what has been the most bitterly fought battle of this whole war. I suspect more people have died trying to defend Bakhmut on the Ukrainian side than in any other single battle that has been fought over the course of this war up to now. And as I've said, despite its somewhat desperate attempts to try to tell people in Britain, the media in Britain, that they should report this as only a symbolic victory for the Russians, the reality is that even the British Ministry of Defence appears to admit, or does admit, that the fall of Bakhmut opens the way for the Russians to threaten first Kramatorsk and then Slavyansk, putting the entire Ukrainian position in Donbass in jeopardy. So that's the information we have been getting about the situation on the battlefields. Now, over the last couple of days, I've been talking about the massive Russian missile strike that is being prepared. We've seen satellite photos about this. We've been hearing lots about this from the Ukrainians. They were predicting that it was going to happen this past week. It hasn't so far happened. Arguably, there was no need for it to happen, because it's quite clear that the Ukrainian energy system isn't functioning effectively, that the cumulative effect of the missile strikes that have already taken place has had a permanent effect, and that already large areas of Ukraine continue to be de-energized without electric power. But that doesn't mean that this missile strike won't happen. It's just that the Russians always decide these things for themselves. They follow their own timetables. They're not going to let that timetable be decided for them by Ukraine, by the West, or by anybody else. Now, I bring this up because, of course, always we have these discussions about Russian capabilities, and it's now gradually dawning on people in the West again about the overwhelming effectiveness of Russian artillery power in Ukraine. Now, we heard a lot about this earlier in the war, in the fighting in the early summer, the fighting that led first to the fall of the important fortified town of Popaznaya in Lugansk region, and then to the Ukrainian loss of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Now we're starting to hear it again. And we've also had a very interesting admission in the Financial Times about the military crisis, the inability of the Western powers to maintain supplies to Ukraine for the weapon systems that Ukraine is constantly demanding if it is to keep its defense, keep defending against the Russians. And we read, for example, this is from the Financial Times now, nearly 10 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the allies that have backed Ukraine's war effort are increasingly concerned by the struggle to increase ammunition production as the conflict chews through their stockpiles. At stake is not only the West's ability to continue supplying Ukraine with the weapons it needs, but also allies' capacity to show adversaries, such as China, that they have an industrial base that can produce sufficient weaponry to mount a credible defense against possible attack. And then we go on to read that after sending more than $40 billion of military support to Ukraine, mostly from existing stocks, NATO members' defense ministries are discovering that dormant weapons production lines, are they actually dormant? Do they even exist? Cannot be switched on overnight. Increasing capacity requires investment, which in turn depends on securing long-term production contracts. And the article goes on to say the United States has sent about a third of its stock of Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine and a third of its stockpile of anti-aircraft Stinger missiles, but it has little prospect of being able to replace these quickly. By the way, I hear the same about HIMARS missiles. Around a third of them have now been provided to Ukraine and are in effect lost. We go on to read further in the article that weapon stocks in many European countries are now even skimpier than in the United States. When France sent 6 Caesar self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine in October, it could only do so by diverting a Danish order for the high-tech artillery. And in fact, we then go on to read the West has a problem with a constrained defense industrial capacity, said Mick Ryan, a former Major General in the Australian Army. A major industrial expansion program will be required if the nations of the West are to rebuild the capacity to produce, design and stockpile large quantities of ammunition. A reconstruction of the West's industrial base? Well, that might happen, but it's not going to happen soon enough to help Ukraine. And then there's a lot of discussion about bureaucracy, problems with bureaucracy. But when you actually drill into that part of the Times article, it's clear that the problem is not bureaucracy at all. It's money. It's that defense contractors are not prepared to start producing large amounts of weapons unless they get paid whatever exorbitant sums they demand, and that they're complaining that so far there isn't enough money on the table from Western governments to make it worth their while to start producing weapons on the kind of scale that would be needed. And one can very easily see, in fact, it's an absolute certainty, that if the West were to decide to try and build up its munition stocks, its weapon stocks, to the kind of levels that the Financial Times is talking about, what that would in practice mean would be that defense costs would rapidly spiral upwards, perhaps out of control. Now, I'm going to just turn now to the topic of artillery, because it's been clear right from the outset of this war that the Russians massively outnumber Ukraine in terms of artillery, and it's also been clear that the Western powers have no ability to match the volumes of artillery that the Russians possess, both in terms of guns and in terms of ammunition. But earlier in the war, back I think in the early summer, when the United States decided that it would start to supply Ukraine with M777 howitzers, and when other countries like France began to also supply guns like the Caesar howitzers that are mentioned in this article, well, I read a great deal about the fact that Western artillery systems outranged Russian ones and were more accurate than Russian artillery systems. And I remember being a little skeptical about those claims, but by and large, I wasn't going to challenge them because, as I've said many times, this really isn't my area of expertise. Well, there's been a whole string of articles about all of this from the Russian media, and it's now clear, at least to me, that if we're talking about the later varieties of 152 millimeter artillery that the Russians possess, like the Star self-propelled gun, well, that is, in essence, it has the same kind of range as Western artillery, 155 millimeter artillery does. But perhaps more interestingly and more importantly, it turns out that the Matka, another self-propelled artillery gun, of which the Russians appear to possess large quantities, which is 203 millimeter self-propelled gun, well, that actually outranges the M777, so that it has a maximum range with powered shells of 47 kilometers as opposed to the 40 kilometers that the M777 can apparently manage. So it looks as if this whole argument that Western artillery outranges Russian artillery is untrue. It depends on the type of gun, and it seems that the Russians have at least as many long-range artillery pieces as Ukraine has been provided by the West. And I suspect part of it is connected with these Excalibur long-range, precision-guided, GPS-guided shells, which are basically all the shells that the United States is now supplying to Ukraine. They're not supplying Ukraine any longer, or so it seems, with ordinary 155 millimeter shells. Well, these are indeed long range and they are indeed precise, but they're expensive. There are relatively few of them. They cannot make up for the heavy volumes, which is what we see the Russians use in places like Bakhmut and no doubt before long in other places. So the other interesting thing about that Financial Times article, if I can return to it, is that there is no obvious solution to the West's problems. We have, of course, the ritualistic article. Western officials say supplying Ukraine has not jeopardized their own country's military readiness, while Russian military shortages are far worse. Well, that's a claim that's been made. Events have never borne it out. And then it goes on to say Moscow is having to source weapons such as artillery, shells and drones from North Korea and Iran. Well, Russia has indeed bought some drones from Iran, but there's no evidence ever been provided that it has actually sourced artillery shells from North Korea. And in fact, both the North Koreans and the Russians have strongly denied that that is the case. And then, of course, we read there is a near consensus across NATO. Near consensus, by the way, means that there is no consensus among NATO, especially its European members, on the need to bulk up their militaries and defence industries. But companies can only proceed once they have more contractual certainty. Contracts matter, money matters, said the Pentagon's LaPlante. This is a Pentagon official. Once the defence companies see that we're going to put money into orders, they'll get it. That's their job. So give more money to the military industrial complex, and in 5, 10, 15 years' time, you'll see more weapon systems, but obviously costs by that point are going to spiral out of control. Well, that's the solution. But to repeat again, it is not a solution for the West's problems in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to return once again to the issue of the battlefronts. There's been, going back to that report from that Greek source about the redeployment of Ukrainian forces to Donbass, some of them being taken from Zaporozhye. Others, by the way, are coming increasingly from Kherson. It is clear that Kherson region west of the Dnieper is being stripped of Ukrainian troops. All Ukraine's forces, all at least the best units that Ukraine had in that area, which were deployed to support the Kherson counteroffensive, they are now being hurriedly redeployed to the east, to Donbass, to Kharkiv region, to try to plug the gaps in the holes that the Russians are now punching. And as for Kherson city itself, well, I've already talked about how Ukraine is trying to evacuate what's left of the civilian population from Kherson city, and there are now confirmation that they've imposed curfews in the city as well. Their control of Kherson city is looking increasingly tenuous. The Ukrainians were never keen, as far as I could judge, on that offensive towards Kherson city. They were pushed into doing it by their Western allies, by the Americans and the British. Jake Sullivan came to Kiev a few weeks ago and told a very reluctant Ukrainian general staff that they should launch this offensive towards Kherson region. The Ukrainians were very skeptical. They said that it looked like a trap, and so it has proved. Now, what the Russians are going to do, whether at some point they might decide to go back to Kherson city, I'm not going to try and guess, but it doesn't look as if this idea of launching that offensive was ever a good one. And coming back to the British Ministry of Defence, I do wonder, quite honestly, whether the advice the British and the Americans have been giving to Ukraine has been wise, the military advice I'm talking about, and we see that the supplies of weapon systems are now running out. So where are we? Where are we in this conflict? Well, there's now discussion about how long this war is going to go on for. And I've taken the view that it's going to continue for at least another year. And I think that that is the Russian plan. But I have to say that another view is starting to gain hold. I watched a program between Garland Nixon and Scott Ritter, both, by the way, people we've been honored to have as guests on the Duran, and both of them seem to think that Ukraine is now on the edge, that its energy system is close to collapse, that the Russian military is close to the point where it's going to launch this big offensive. Probably all it's doing now is waiting for the ground to harden a bit more before it does, and perhaps it will launch that massive missile strike in cooperation with that movements on the ground. I mean, I'm not going to try and guess about this. Anyway, they seem to be edging towards the view that perhaps this war isn't going to be very long after all. Perhaps Ukraine will go crashing down in the next few months. I'm not saying that that is what they said would happen, but that possibility is now being floated. Well, we'll just have to see. What is the West doing in the meantime? Well, after painstaking negotiations, the European Union and the G7 have now imposed a $60 cap on Russian oil traded outside the United States and Europe. In other words, third parties who want to buy Russian oil are supposed to pay less than $60 for it, or up to $60 for it, if they're going to be able to obtain Western or specifically European services like insurance, legal things, and all of that. Everybody knows that this is unenforceable, that countries like China, India, Turkey, the rest will simply buy Russian oil at whatever price they can negotiate with the Russians. Moreover, we now have reports, again from the Financial Times, that the Russians have been quietly buying oil tankers, and they now have a fleet of around 100 oil tankers, all of which can be used to supply this oil, or at least most of it, to their customers. And of course, countries like India and China have their own fleets. They can also buy and transport oil on their own ships. And everybody also knows that much of this oil will end up in Europe, but not at a discount, but at a premium, and that this oil will simply be mixed with other oil, and that's apparently perfectly legal. And if that happens, then it can be sold or resold to Europe, to the United States, without any legal problem. In other words, the Europeans and the G7, the Americans, the Australians, they've come up with an incredibly complicated, enormously elaborate mechanism which everybody understands and accepts isn't going to succeed, but which is going to provide certain middlemen with massive opportunities for huge profits. The other bizarre thing is that because the Russians are having to sell their oil at a discount to their various customers, it seems that the $60 price, $60 a barrel price for the oil which the G7 has set is about the price, the level of the price that the Russians are actually selling their oil at. So it doesn't actually, it wouldn't, even if it were enforced, which it won't be, it wouldn't actually affect Russian income to any significant degree. And the G7 has also said that this is obviously a variable cap, and the cap that will be applied in future will be 5% below whatever the market price of oil is, with the cap being reviewed regularly at 2 monthly intervals. So if the price of oil rises to $150, well, the price that the Russians would be able to sell the oil, if the cap were ever enforced, would be 5% below $150 a barrel. This is a ludicrous scheme. As I said, nobody outside the G7, the ring of G7 states, is going to be interested in applying it. This discount that the Russians are currently giving for the oil that they're selling to countries like India, China, and all the rest, that will gradually erode away. The Russians had to do that over the course of 2022 in order to secure a customer base in all of these countries, India, China, Turkey, all the rest. Once trading relations are established, once these countries become accustomed to sourcing their oil from Russia, you can be confident it inevitably happens that discounts start to evaporate away and prices are decided on pure supply and demand issues. Now, what makes this even more weird is that there's some economists who are apparently saying that Russia could, in theory, respond to this oil price cap by cutting oil production by 3 million barrels a day. And that would push up the price of oil to a dramatic extent without affecting significantly either Russia's revenues, because the oil price would rise, and without actually doing any damage, significant damage, to Russian production facilities. In other words, the Russians have it in their power to push up the oil price much higher than it is at this point, and they could do that in response, in theory, in response to this particular step that the G7 are taking. I don't think they're going to do that for one very simple reason, which is that from a Russian point of view, raising the oil price in that kind of way is going to lose them friends where it really matters, in China, India, Turkey, the global south, and all the rest. And since they can brush off this oil price cap, why would they bother? So I don't think they're going to do that, but it does actually, again, illustrate the underlying truth that the Russians are in a position to blow this oil price cap out of the water without this causing any real significant harm to them. Well, there we go. We are out of weapons that we can supply to Ukraine. We're going to have to, in the West, come up with all sorts of ideas about how to increase production of weapons. That's not really to help Ukraine. That's for the long-term future. The costs threaten to spiral out of control, and we've come up with an oil price cap idea that everybody quietly understands is unworkable and counterproductive, and will simply mean that the price of oil in Europe is going to be higher than it is everywhere else. Now, that perhaps explains what we've been talking about in previous programs, these overtures to the Russians. We now learn, as I said, that Naryshkin and Burns, the Russian and American intelligence chiefs, in their meeting in Ankara, did indeed discuss the Ukrainian conflict. We've seen Biden coming up and saying that he's prepared to talk to Putin about ways of ending the Ukraine war, that Macron apparently wants to do the same. There's even an extraordinary story floating around that when Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, telephoned Putin, he came up with an incredibly elaborate plan to end the conflict. This is that the Russians agree that the Moldovan government take control of Transnistria. This is an autonomous Russian-speaking region within Moldova, part of Novorossiya, by the way, the original Tsarist province of Novorossiya. In return, Ukraine recognize Crimea as part of Russia, grant Russia control of a land bridge to Crimea. I'm not entirely sure whether that means that Kherson region and Zaporozhye would be actually ceded to Russia by Ukraine. I doubt it, actually. I think the idea is that there'd be some kind of elaborate mechanism whereby the Russians would be allowed to transport goods and people to Crimea across this land bridge from Donbass. Donbass presumably granted also some kind of enormous autonomy all of these things. An enormously complicated, very elaborate plan, and with all the sanctions apparently being lifted, and of course with things supposedly going back to the way they were before the war, which is something that Scholz has publicly said. Well, all I will say is if Scholz came to Putin with a proposal like that, I am not surprised that the conversation between Scholz and Putin was as fiery as I said in my previous video, because I cannot imagine Putin at this time being impressed by this proposal. All the signs point at this present time to the Russians having the initiative in this conflict. They're moving their forces into place. They're building up their forces in Ukraine. Ukraine's military has been severely depleted and weakened. The West is out of weapons and ammunition that it can send to Ukraine. Ukraine's economy is in deep crisis. Its energy system is in a state of collapse. And the West has run out of things it can do. So I don't think the Russians are in any mood to negotiate at this present time. I don't think they're in any position to negotiate as it happens. I think if the Russian government started indulging in the kind of proposals that Scholz has just come up with, I think the reaction from Russian public opinion would be so negative that I think it'd be more trouble for the Russian government than it was worth to go down the route of looking at these sort of proposals. So everything now points to the Russian offensive coming, maybe around the new year, and to the Russians tidying up places like Bakhmut, Ugledar, Donetsk, all of these places beforehand. In other words, shaping the battlefield in advance of the great battle which is to come. So that's where I think we are. We're probably at an important inflection point in this crisis, but we'll just have to see. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program. There'll be more from me, of course, soon. I'll be providing you with more updates about what the situation is looking like. And in the meantime, remember, you can find all our videos on our other platforms, Locals, BitChute, Odyssey, Telegram, Rockfin, and the rest. And also, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop. You can buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all of those great things. And last but not least, please remember to press the like button if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.